We shall now consider the statements which the scientists have been collecting during the last few years, collating, over a dividing space of hundreds and thousands of years, the affirmations of the ancient religions and those of the occultists. These throw a new light on the problem. They corroborate, in short, by experiment, the esoteric doctrines in respect of the astral or etheric body, or the unknown guest, if you prefer it, in respect of its extraordinary and incomprehensible faculties, its probable survival, and its independence of our physical body. We all knew that a very considerable portion of our life, of our personality, lay buried in the darkness of the unconscious or the subconscious. In this darkness we housed the whole of our organic life, that of the stomach, the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and even the brain. And there they did their work, in an obscurity never pierced by a ray of consciousness save by chance. In illness, for example, there, too, we lodged our instincts, the lowest and the highest alike, with all that was mysterious, innate and irresistible in our knowledge, our aspirations, our tastes, our capacities, our temperaments, and many other things which we have no time to examine. But for some years now the scientific investigation of hypnotism and mediumship has enormously enlarged and illuminated this extraordinary and magical domain of the unconscious. We have come, step by step, to establish the fact, in an objective, material and indubitable fashion, that our little conscious cerebral life is as nothing compared with the vast ultracerebral and secret life which we live simultaneously. For this unknown life contains the past and the future, and even in the present can project itself to enormous distances from our physical body. In particular, we have ascertained that the restricted, unreliable, and unstable memory which we thought unique is duplicated in the darkness by another memory which is unrestricted, indefatigable, inexhaustible, incorruptible, unshakable, and infallible, recording somewhere, perhaps in the brain, but in any case not in the brain as we know it and as it controls our consciousness, for it seems to be independent of the condition of this brain, recording indelibly the most trivial events, the slightest emotions, the most fugitive thoughts of our lives. Thus, to cite only one example from among 1,000, a servant who was absolutely illiterate was able, in the hypnotic state, to repeat without a mistake whole pages of Sanskrit, having some years earlier heard her first employer, who was an Orientalist, reading passages from the Vedas. It has thus been proved that every chapter of every one of the thousands of books that we have read remains indelibly photographed on the tablets of our memory and may, at a given moment, reappear before our eyes without the loss of a period or a comma. Thus again Colonel D. Rochers, in his experiments on the retrogression of the memory and the personality, made his subjects go back over the whole course of their lives, down to their very early childhood, whose least details were resuscitated with an extraordinary distinctness and perspective, details which, when they were verified, were acknowledged to be absolutely correct. He did even better than this. He succeeded in arousing the memory of their previous lives. But here, verification being more difficult, his experiments are hardly to the point, and I wish to lead you only onto the firm ground of established and undisputed facts. Well, then, here is an enormous part of ourselves which escapes us, of whose life we know nothing, of which we make no use, which lives and records and acts outside our conscious minds. An ideal memory, which is, practically speaking, of no use to us, by the side of which the memory that obeys us is no more than a restricted summit, a sort of pinnacle, incessantly abraded by time, emerging from the ocean of oblivion, beneath which spreads away, downward and outward, a huge mountain of unchangeable memories, by which the brain is unable to profit. Now on what do we base our personality, the nature of our ego, the identity which above all things we fear to lose by death? Entirely on our conscious memory, for we know no other. And this memory, compared with the other, is, as we have seen, precarious and insignificant. Is it not time to ask ourselves where our ego really exists, where our true personality resides? Is it in the restricted, uncertain, precarious memory, or in the spacious, infallible, and unshakable one? Which self should we choose after death? That which consists only of hesitating reminiscences, or the other, which represents the whole man, with no solution of continuity, which has not let slip a single action or spectacle or sensation of our lifetime, and retains, living within it, the self of all those who have died before us? While there is reason to fear that the first memory, that of which our brain makes use, is impaired or extinguished at the moment of death, just as it is impaired or diminished by the least ill health during life, is it not, on the other hand, more probable that the other more capacious memory, which no shock, no sickness can confuse, will resist the terrific shock of death? And is there not a very good chance that we shall find it intact beyond the grave? If this is not so, why this stupendous work of registration, this incredible accumulation of unused photographs, for in ordinary life we never even wipe the dust from them when the few landmarks of our cerebral memory are enough to maintain the essential outlines of our identity? It is admitted that nature has made nothing useless. We must therefore suppose that these pictures will be of use later on, that elsewhere they will be necessary. And where can this elsewhere be, save in another life? The inevitable objection will be made that it is the brain alone which registers the images and phrases of this memory, just as it registers the images and phrases of the other memory, and that when the brain is dead, etc., there may be some force in this objection. But would it not be more than a little strange were the brain unaided to perform, with a care which would completely absorb it, all these operations, which do not concern it, which it disregards a moment later, and of which it does not seem to have any clear conception? In any case, this is not the brain as we commonly understand it. And here already we have a very important admission. But this hidden memory, this cryptomnesia, as the specialists have called it, is only one of the aspects of cryptopsychics, or the hidden psychology of the unconscious. I have no time to recapitulate here all that the scholar, the scientist, the artist, and the mathematician owe to the collaboration of the subconscious. We have all profited more or less by this mysterious collaboration, this subconscious self, this unfamiliar personality, which I have elsewhere called the unknown guest, which lives and acts on its own initiative, apart from the conscious life of the brain, represents not only our entire past life, which its memory crystallizes as part of an integral whole. It also has a presentiment of our future, which it often discerns and reveals. For truthful predictions on the part of certain specially endowed sensitives or somnambulistic subjects, in respect of personal details, are so plentiful that it is hardly possible any longer to deny the existence of this prophetic faculty. In time, accordingly, the subconscious self enormously overflows our small conscious ego, which dwells on the narrow tableland of the present. In space, likewise, it overflows it in a no less astonishing degree, crossing the oceans and the mountains, covering hundreds of miles in a second. It warns us of the death or the misfortune which has befallen or is threatening a friend or relative at the other side of the world. As to this point, there is no longer the slightest doubt, and, owing to the verification of thousands of such instances, we need no longer make the reservations which have just been made in respect of predictions of the future. This unknown and probably colossal guest, though we need not measure him today, having only to verify his existence, is, for the rest, much less a new personality than a personality which has been forgotten since the recrudescence of our positive sciences. Our various religions know more of it than we do, and it matters little whether they call it soul, spirit, etheric body, astral body, or divine spark. For this guest of ours is always the same transcendental entity which includes our brain and our conscious ego, which probably existed before this conscious ego, and is quite as likely to survive it as to precede it, and without which it would be impossible to explain 3/4 of the essential phenomena of our lives. Passing over for the moment some of the other properties of this singular personality, which we believe to be forever relegated to invisibility, together with materialization, ideoplasty, levitation, lucidity, bilocation, psychometry, etc., it remains for me to explain in what a curious and unexpected fashion a somewhat recent science has succeeded in recording, investigating, and analyzing some of these physical manifestations, and to inquire how far these observations increase the probabilities of the survival or the immortality of the identical personality, which after all may very well be the essential and imperishable portion of our ego. I have just explained how far the investigation of hypnotism and mediumship has enlarged the field of the subconscious. Hitherto, in accordance with the school to which the investigator belonged, the phenomena established have been attributed either to suggestion or to a fluid of unknown nature, examination having as yet been confined to recording their amazing results. Matters were in this position, and the disputes between the suggestionists and the mesmerists were threatening to become permanent, when about 50 years ago to be exact, in 1886 and 1867, an Austrian scientist, Baron von Reichenbach, published his first papers on odic emanations. Dr. Karl von Prell, a German scientist, completed Reichenbach's work, and, being gifted with a scientific mind of the first order and intuitive powers which often amounted to genius, he was able to deduce all its consequences. These two writers have not yet had full justice done to them, and their works have not yet obtained the reputation which they deserve. We need not be surprised by this, for the progress of official science, the only science that permeates the public, is always a much more leisurely affair than that of independent science. It was more than a century before Volta's electricity became our modern electricity and the ruler of the industrial world. More than a century, too, had passed since the experiments of Mesmer before hypnotism was finally acknowledged by the medical academies, investigated at the universities, and classed as a branch of therapeutics. It may be as long before Reichenbach's experiments, improved by von Prell and completed by D. Rochers, begin to bear fruit. In the meantime, their investigations throw an abundant light on a whole series of obscure and confused phenomena whose objective existence they have been the first to prove, while indicating their source. Reichenbach really rediscovered the universal vital fluid, which is none other than the Akasha of the prehistoric religions, the telesma of Hermes, the living fire of Zoroaster, the generative fire of Heraclitus, the astral light of the Kabbalah, the alkahest of Paracelsus, the vital spirit of the occultists, and the vital force of Saint Thomas. He called it Uod, from a Sanskrit word whose meaning is that which penetrates everywhere, and he saw in it quite correctly the extreme limit of our analysis of man, the point where the line of demarcation between soul and body disappears, so that it seems that the secret quintessence of man must be euodic. I cannot, of course, describe in these pages the innumerable experiments of Reichenbach, von Prell, and D. Rochers. It is enough to say that in principle the odd is the magnetic or vital fluid which at every moment of our existence emanates from every part of our being in uninterrupted vibrations. In the normal state, these emanations or effluvia whose existence was suspected, thanks to the phenomena of hypnotism, are absolutely unknown to us and invisible. Reichenbach was the first to discover that sensitives, that is to say, subjects in a state of hypnosis, could see these effluvia quite distinctly in the darkness, as the result of a very great number of experiments, from which every possibility of conscious or unconscious suggestion was carefully eliminated. He was able to prove that the strength and volume of these emanations varied in accordance with the emotions, the state of mind, or the health of those who produced them. That those proceeding from the right side of the body are always bluish in color, while those from the left side are of a reddish yellow. He also states that similar emanations proceed not only from human beings, animals, and plants, but even from minerals. He succeeded in photographing the odd emanating from rock crystal, the odd given off by human beings, the odd resulting from chemical operations, the odd from amorphous lumps of metal, and that produced by noise or friction. In a word, he proved that magnetism, or odd, exists throughout nature, a doctrine which has always been taught by the occultists of all countries and all ages. Here then we have the existence of this universal emanation experimentally demonstrated. Now let us inquire into its properties and effects. I shall confine myself to a few essential facts. Thanks to these emanations, it has been possible to prove that this fluid is the same as that which produces the manifestations of table turning. In the eyes of a sensitive, indeed, these manifestations are accompanied by luminous phenomena whose synchronism leaves no doubt that the emission of the fluid is correlated with the movements of the table. The latter does not move until the radiations proceeding from the hands of those experimenting have become sufficiently powerful. These radiations condense into luminous columns over the center of the table, and the more intense they become, the more lively is the table. When they fade away, the table falls back motionless. Some recent experiments by Mr. W. J. Kilner, described in his book, The Human Atmosphere, give positive proof of the existence of these emanations, these effluvia, this human aura, or at least of a similar aura which constitutes a true astral or etheric double. It is enough to look at this subject through a screen formed of a very flat glass dish containing an alcoholic solution of dicyanin, a coal tar derivative which makes the retina sensitive to the ultraviolet rays, and the aura becomes visible not only to sensitives, as in Reichenbach's experiments, but also in the eyes of 95% of persons possessed of normal vision. It is, however, possible that this aura is not an etheric double, but a mere nervous radiation. In this connection, see the excellent summary by Monsieur René Souda in No. 3 of the Bulletin des Instituts Metapsychiques International, January-February 1921. It is the same with the displacement of objects without contact, levitation, and so forth. Manifestations which today are so far established and verified that there is no need to repeat their occurrence. It is therefore an established fact that this fluid, which is able to set in motion a pendulum in a glass vase hermetically sealed with the blowpipe, just as it is capable of lifting a table weighing more than 200 pounds, possesses a power which at times is enormous and is independent of our muscles. This power may be attributed to our nerves, our minds, or what not, but is no less plainly and purely spiritual in its nature. Moreover, it is almost certain, although the experimental proofs are in this case less complete and more difficult, on account of the scarcity of subjects, that it is the same odic or odyllic force that intervenes in the phenomena of materialization, notably in those produced by the celebrated Eusapia Polodino and by Madame Bissine, which latter are far more conclusive and far more strictly controlled by the medium. It probably draws, either from the medium or from the spectator, the plastic substance with whose help it fashions and organizes the tangible bodies which are called into existence and disappear in the course of these manifestations, thereby giving us a very curious glimpse of the manner in which thought, spirit, or the creative fluid acts upon matter, concentrating and shaping it, and how it sets about the business of creating our own bodies. It has further been experimentally demonstrated that this odic or odyllic fluid may be conveyed from place to place. Any material object may be filled with it. The object magnetized, into which the hypnotist has poured some portion of his vital energy, all possibility of suggestion being set aside, will always retain the same influence over the sensitive or medium. That is, the influence desired by the hypnotist. It will make the medium laugh or weep, shiver or perspire, dance or slumber, according to the purpose of the hypnotist when he emitted the vital fluid. Moreover, the fluid appears to be indestructible. A marble pestle, magnetized and placed successively in hydrochloric, nitric, and sulfuric acids and subjected to the corrosive action of ammonia, loses nothing of its power. An iron bar heated to a white heat, resin melted and solidified in a different shape, water that has been boiled, paper burned and reduced to ashes, all retain their power. Further, to prove that the detection of this force is not dependent on human impressions, it has been shown that water which has been magnetized and then boiled causes the needle of a rheostat, an instrument for measuring electric currents, to deviate through an angle of 20 degrees, just as it did before it was boiled. It would be interesting to know whether this vital force, thus imprisoned in a material object, can survive the hypnotist. I do not know whether any experiments have been made in respect of this detail. In any case, it has been observed that more than 6 months after they were charged with the most miscellaneous substances, iron, tin, resin, wax, sulfur, and marble, retained their magnetic powers intact. Not only does the odic fluid thus transferred contain and reproduce the will of the hypnotist, it also contains and represents part of the personality of the hypnotic subject, and in particular his sensitiveness to impressions. Colonel de Rochas has conducted, in connection with this phenomenon, which he calls the externalization of sensibility, a host of experiments, bewildering yet unassailable and conclusive, which lead us straight back to the magical practices of the wizards of antiquity and the sorcerers of the Middle Ages, which shows us once more that the most fantastic beliefs or superstitions, provided they are sufficiently general, almost always contain a hidden or forgotten truth. I need not refer the reader of these pages to experiments which are familiar to all those who have ever glanced through a volume dealing with metapsychics. I must keep within certain bounds, and what I have said is enough to establish the fact that there is within us a vital principle which is not indissolubly bound up with the body, but is able to leave it, to externalize itself, or at least in part, and for a brief period, during our lifetime. It may be rendered visible. It possesses a power independent of our muscles. It is able to condense matter, to shape it, to organize it, to make it live, not merely in appearance, like phantoms of the imagination, but like actual tangible bodies, whose substance evaporates and returns to us in the most inexplicable fashion. We have also seen that this vital principle may be transferred to a given object, and there, despite all physical and chemical treatment of the object, it will maintain, indestructibly, the will of the hypnotist and the sensibility of the hypnotized subject. May we not at this point ask ourselves whether, being to this extent separable from and independent of the body, whether being so far indestructible, as, for example, in the ashes of a burned document, which contained only a very small portion of it, whether this vital fluid does not survive the destruction of the body? In reply to this question we have, quite apart from logic, The extremely impressive evidence of those learned societies which have devoted themselves to the investigation of strictly authenticated cases of survival, and, in particular, the 500 to 600 apparitions of the dead verified by the Society for Psychical Research. It must be admitted that these apparitions, which are probably odic manifestations from beyond the grave, seem far more credible when we are acquainted with certain properties of the mysterious fluid which we have been considering. Since the death of the leaders of the odic school Reich Feenbach, von Prell, and D. Rokers, the investigation of the magnetic or odic fluid has been somewhat neglected. Mistakenly, to our thinking, for it was by no means exhaustive. But there are fashions in metapsychics as in everything else. The Society for Psychical Research, in particular, during the last few years, has devoted itself almost exclusively to the problems of cross-correspondences. And while its inquiry has not yielded absolutely unassailable results, it does at least permit us to believe more and more seriously in the presence all about us of spiritual entities, invisible and intelligent, disembodied or other spirits, who amuse themselves. The word is employed advisedly by proving to us that they make nothing of space or time and are pursuing some purpose which we cannot as yet understand. I know, of course, that we can, strictly speaking, attribute these unexpected communications to the unknown faculties of the subconsciousness. But this hypothesis becomes daily more precarious, and it may be that the time is not far distant when we shall be finally compelled to admit the existence of these disembodied entities, doubles, wandering spirits, elementals, Zion Chones, devas, cosmic spirits, which the occultists of old never doubted. In this connection, to say nothing for the present of Sir Oliver Lodge's Raymond, or of the highly interesting spiritualistic experiments of P.E. Cornelia, or of a host of other experiments the consideration of which would take us too far afield, the recent researches of Dr. W. Crawford, which have made a sensation in the world of metapsychics, have afforded a remarkable confirmation of the theory of the invisibles. It is true, however, as we shall see, that this confirmation proceeds less from the facts themselves than from the interpretation which has been placed upon them. W. J. Crawford, a doctor of science and a professor in Belfast University, has of late undertaken a series of experiments in connection with telekinesia, or movements without contact. Experiments which were conducted with a degree of scientific precision that wholly excluded any idea of fraud, and which absolutely confirmed those which Crookes, the Institut Psychologique, and Okorovich carried out with Home, Eusapia Polodino, and Mademoiselle Tomskik as mediums. The subject of these experiments was that most peculiar phenomenon which is a sort of physical externalization of the duplication, amorphous at first, and afterward more or less plastic, of the medium. From the medium's body proceeds an indefinable substance, which is sometimes visible, as in the case of Eva, Madame Bissine's medium, and sometimes invisible, as in the case of Crawford's medium, but which, even though invisible, may be touched and measured, and behaves as though it possessed an objective reality. This substance, moist, cold and sometimes viscous, which is known as ectoplasm, can be weighed, and its weight exactly corresponds with the weight lost by the medium, and it may attain as much as 50% of the medium's normal weight. In these experiments, this invisible substance behaves as though it emerged from the medium's body in the form of a more or less rigid stem, which lifts a table placed at a certain distance from the chair in which the medium is seated. If the table is too heavy to be lifted directly at arm's length, so to speak, the psychic stem or lever curves itself, chooses a fulcrum on the floor, and erects itself to lift the weight. When this invisible lever has its fulcrum in the medium's body, the weight of the latter is increased by that of the object lifted. But when it selects a fulcrum on the floor, the medium's weight is diminished by the pressure exerted on the floor. These phenomena of levitation were perfectly well known before Dr. Crawford's investigation. But by his discovery of the invisible lever, sometimes perceptible to the touch and even capable of being photographed, he is the first to reveal the entire material and psychical mechanism. Moreover, in the course of his innumerable experiments, he noted that everything happened as though invisible entities were watching the experiments, assisting and even directing him. He communicated with them by means of typology, and having remarked that these mysterious operators did not seem fully to understand the scientific interest of the phenomena, he questioned them and concluded from their replies that they were only laborers of some sort, manipulating forces which they did not understand, and accomplishing a task required of them by a higher order of beings who could not or did not condescend to do the work themselves. It may of course be maintained that these invisible collaborators emanate from the subconsciousness of the medium or of other persons present, so that the problem is still unsolved. But a conviction which a scientist who was, to begin with, as skeptical as Dr. Crawford, was gradually, and by the very force of things, led to accept, deserves to be seriously considered. In any case, his experiments, like those in connection with the odic fluid, prove once more that our being is far more immaterial, more psychic, more mysterious, more powerful, and assuredly more enduring than we believe it to be. And this was taught us by the primitive religions, as it is taught by the occultists who have been inspired thereby. While we do not lose sight of the other spiritualistic manifestations, the posthumous apparitions, the phenomena of psychometry and materialization, the provision of the future, the mystery of speaking animals, the miracles of Lourdes and other places of pilgrimage, which we mention here only to show that we have not overlooked them. Here, as compared with the prodigious and arrogant affirmations of the past, are the half-certainties, the petty details slowly reconquered by the occultists of today. At first sight this is little enough, and even if the great central problem of our metapsychics, the problem of survival, were at length solved, this long and eagerly anticipated solution would not take us very far. Assuredly not nearly so far as the priests of India and Egypt went. But modest though they may be, the discoveries of our occultists have at least the advantage of being founded upon facts which we can verify, and should therefore be of far greater value to us than the more impressive hypotheses which have hitherto evaded verification. Now it is quite possible that to penetrate any further into the regions which they are exploring, the experimental methods which are the safest in other sciences may prove insufficient. Other elements must be considered than those which science is accustomed to encounter. Forces may perhaps be in question of a more spiritual nature than those of our intellect, and in order to grasp and control them it may first be necessary to apply ourselves to our own spiritualization. It is an advantage to possess perfectly organized laboratories, but the true laboratory whence the ultimate discoveries will proceed is probably within us. This the priests and magi of the great religions seem to have understood better than we. For when they purposed to enter the ultra-spiritual domains of nature, they underwent a protracted preparation. They felt that it was not enough that they should be learned, but that they must before all become saints. They began by the training of their will, by the sacrifice of their whole being, by dying to all desire. They enfolded their intellectual energies in a moral force which led them far more directly to the plane on which the strange phenomena which they were investigating had their being. It is probable enough that there are in the invisible, or the infinite, things that the understanding cannot grasp, on which it has no hold, but to which another faculty can attain. And this faculty is perhaps what is known as the soul, or that higher subconsciousness which the ancient religions had learned to cultivate by spiritual exercises, and above all by a renunciation and a spiritual concentration of which we have forgotten the rules and even the idea.